Welcome, everyone, to Creating a Family. Talk about infertility and adoption. Today we're going to be talking about transgender reproductive issues, both the medical as well as the emotional. Fascinating topic, an important one for all of you to hear. Here's a sample of what you're going to hear.
A transgender woman taking estrogen would suppress spermatogenesis to levels that are very, very low or sometimes even non-existent. And there's a possibility that suppression may not be reversible in contrast to the suppression of testosterone in transgender men.
I'm Dawn Davenport. I'm the director of Creating a Family. We are the National Infertility and Adoption Education and Support nonprofit, and you can find us online at creatingafamily.org. We primarily keep in touch with our audience through our weekly e-newsletter. We let you know about the latest developments in the world of infertility as well as adoption. You get to choose two newsletters. You choose whether you want to know about infertility or adoption. Comes out once a week, and it tells you about the upcoming week blog topic as well as the show topic, allowing you to send in any questions you might have ahead of time. It comes out, as I mentioned, once a week, and you can sign up for it on any page, top right corner of our website, creatingafamily.org. The Creating a Family radio show is underwritten by our corporate sponsor, Ferring Pharmaceutical. Ferring has a free program they want you to know about, My Fertility Navigator. This program offers free one-on-one support for women who are struggling to create a family. That you have a personalized navigator, a fertility navigator, that is assigned to you when you sign up for the program, and they will be able to provide personalized guidance from covering just a whole host of topics, just basic information about infertility and fertility, as well as providing you with information about nearby fertility centers, how to afford fertility treatment, and things such as that. You can get more information at myfertilitynav.com/CAF. Again, myfertilitynav.com/CAF. The Creating a Family show is underwritten by is underwritten by our sponsors, or supported, I should say, by our sponsors and partners who believe in our mission of providing unbiased education and support to those struggling to create a family. A few of our gold sponsors include Reproductive Medicine Associates of New York. They are a full-service fertility center specializing in vitro fertilization, egg donation, and egg embryo freezing, LGBTQ family building, reproductive surgeries, and male reproductive medicine. Highly individualized patient care is offered through 13 reproductive endocrinologists and fertility specialists. They also have a urologist on staff as well. We also have Fairfax Cryobank. They have been a leader in sperm donation for over 25 years. They are dedicated to supplying updated, verified, and accurate medical and personal information on their donors. Only 1 in 200 applicants make it through their screening process to become a donor. Today we're going to be talking about transgender reproductive issues, both the medical as well as the emotional. We'll be talking with Dr. Samuel Pang. He is a board-certified reproductive endocrinologist at IVF New England, where he also serves as the director of its LGBTQ program. He has presented at seminars both locally and nationally on this topic, including First Event, one of the longest-running and largest transgender conferences in the world. We also have Dr. Jamie Joseph. She is a certified transgender therapist with extensive training and experience in working with and counseling transgender and gender nonconforming individuals and their families, friends, and loved ones. She is a member of the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. Thank you both so much for being with us today on Creating a Family. I'd like to start by talking with you, or by getting us all on the same level. As far as terminology. And one of the things as I was researching for this interview was the realization that there is a lack of relevant clinical and cultural competence among providers. And so transgender patients who are seeking reproductive health care often fear that they're going to be treated with disrespect or being judged because of their gender identities or their sexual choice, or because aspects of their bodies may not conform to the gender norms. So we're talking about, I want to put us on the level playing field here. Transgender people is what we're talking about, and the reproductive issues that they may face. One of the things, and let's start off with a definition. Transgender people are people whose gender identity, that is their innate knowledge of who they are, is different from the gender that they were thought to be at birth. So a transgender woman lives as a woman today but was thought to be male when she was born. A transgender man lives as a man today but was thought to be female when he was born. Some transgender people identify as neither male or female or as a combination of male and female. And there are a variety of terms that I have heard that are used to refer to people that aren't entirely male or entirely female, non-binary, genderqueer, or queer. Also, trans is often used as a shorthand for transgender. All right, so let's begin. We did receive a question, and Dr. Pang, I will direct this one to you. What is the difference between transgender and intersex? And the second part of that question is an intersex child more likely to be transgender?
First, I want to say thank you for inviting me to be part of the show. It's a pleasure to be here. So in response to the question, my understanding of transgender is gender identity of the person, whereas with the intersex individual, the intersex individual is typically born with ambiguous genitalia. And their genetic sex, meaning whether they have XY chromosomes or XX chromosomes, can be determined by chromosomal testing, but their genitalia, the external genitalia and sometimes internal genitalia, may be ambiguous due to some medical or genetic reason. And intersex individuals, I don't have a lot of experience with, but in response to the question, I am not sure that there's any studies showing whether or not intersex individuals are more likely to be transgender. My understanding of the issues with intersex individuals is that frequently if they were assigned a birth surgically because of ambiguous genitalia and they grow up, that may not be their gender identity, and that can cause the conflict for them.
And then that would cause them to be, at that point, transgender if in fact at the gender that they were assigned at birth, the gender that the surgery created at birth did not match with their identity. I guess it's possible.
Correct.
Would it be fair to say it's possible to be both transgender and intersex, but most transgender people aren't intersex, and I suspect most intersex people aren't transgender. Would that be a fair summary of that?
That is correct.
All right. So we're going to start talking about sexual and reproductive health for transgender people in general, and then we'll shift to talking about ways that trans can have a family or issues that come up when they are trying to create a family at that point. All right. Dr. Joseph, let's start with you. What are some of the typical reproductive health issues facing transgender men and women? And let's start with transgender men, that is, people who are living as male but were thought to have been female at birth. What are some of the issues that they might face in the general reproductive health area?
Okay, so thank you for having me as well. So for transgender males who were biologically identified female at birth, one of the things to be considered would be whether or not they are going to be carrying a pregnancy, and that would need to be really discussed early on in their gender transition treatment in terms of what their goals would be with regard to building families. So if that person desired to carry their own pregnancy, they'd really need to be planning that well before any sorts of surgeries that would prevent them from doing so. So it's very important for whether we're talking about males or females or anywhere on the gender spectrum for individuals to think about their reproductive capacity, their desires possibly of building families and what they might want in the future, because preserving their ability to create their own offspring and or carry those offspring is really important before foreclosing on any options with transgender medical treatments such as hormones or surgeries. So for all people, it's really important to understand the fertility options that are medically available for people well before they do any transitioning.
Yeah, fertility preservation. I read one research that indicated only about 40% of people considered of trans people considered fertility preservation before they transitioned, and we'll talk about transitioning here in a bit. But the impact of transitioning very often will render them infertile. Depending, of course, on what we're going to swing back to that, talking about transitioning and the impact. Dr. Pang, this is actually, I'm going to direct this to you too, Dr. Joseph. Let me start with you, Dr. Joseph. The transgender men who have sex with men are at risk for unintended pregnancy. And so it begs the question of kind of the opposite of trying to create a family, the opposite of trying to prevent an unintended pregnancy. So how important is birth control, and quite frankly, for a frank discussion about birth control for transgender people, Dr. Joseph, and is that happening?
Though I definitely have those kinds of conversations with my clients, that there is a risk of pregnancy, that gender treatment in and of itself is not birth control. So birth control options do need to be discussed with the medical providers as well.
Yeah, it seems to me that that's one that would be particularly troublesome. And often overlooked, because if in this case, if you're living as a man, it's not something that you would be focusing on or thinking about. All right, Dr. Pang, what are some other issues, not necessarily reproductive health issues, but not necessarily issues associated with trying to get pregnant or trying to create a family? What are some of those typical typical would be the right word, reproductive health issues that a transgender man might face in addition to birth control and thinking about fertility preservation?
Well, I agree with Dr. Joseph that the counseling before they transition is important, because the hormonal and other drug treatments that they receive could potentially render them infertile or sterile, depending on what treatments they have in the surgery. So it's really important that these transgender men be counseled ahead of time, so that they know, what their options are before they transition. I have treated transgender men who come in for fertility preservation with egg freezing. And they come in either before they begin transition, or I've had men who come in after they begin transition, and then they have to go off their testosterone therapy to do their egg freezing process. I've also treated transgender men, at least one transgender man who decided to carry a pregnancy for himself. And eventually was successful in carrying a pregnancy for himself. So there are different options, and everybody's different, and everybody has different intentions and feelings about these issues. So it's really important to counsel people about the different options that they have and what they plan to do before they actually transition.
Absolutely, because as we said, unfortunately, the transition itself can render you infertile. So let's go ahead and talk about that. We're still talking right now. We're going to swing back to talking about transgender women. But right now we're still talking about transgender men. So let's talk about some of the issues that they would face with transition. Many trans people undergo medical procedures in order to transition. what are some of the typical things that they might do or have done that they need to consider that they want to become pregnant? Dr. Pang just mentioned for a trans man taking testosterone. All right, so what is the impact of testosterone? I guess this is a medical question, so let me send it to you, Dr. Pang. What's the impact of testosterone on a woman's fertility, on the female fertile anatomy, reproductive anatomy?
For most trans men who go on testosterone therapy, the testosterone will suppress ovarian function and suppress ovulation, so that their ovaries stop ovulating. And for practical purposes, their ovaries aren't functioning. So if they decide that they want to preserve their fertility with egg freezing, or they want to conceive and carry a child, they would need to go off the testosterone therapy for a few weeks. And the effect of testosterone therapy in the cases that I've seen have mostly been reversible. So as soon as the testosterone clears out of their system, their ovarian function kicks back in, and they begin ovulating again, and we are able to do fertility preservation and harvest eggs from them.
Is their ovarian reserve diminished because of the testosterone? Or generally speaking, is it totally reversible, so that when after the testosterone has left their system and they have started menstruating on a regular basis, that they would have the same success that you would expect given their age, whatever their age is, as somebody who had not been on testosterone? Would his experience be the same as if he had not ever taken testosterone?
I don't have any database or research that can prove the answers to that question, but just thinking about the physiology of ovarian function and the effect of testosterone on the physiology of ovarian function, I would guess that removing the testosterone would allow the ovaries to kick back in and begin functioning again. And my best guess is that the testosterone therapy does not diminish their ovarian reserve. What would diminish their ovarian reserve would be their age.
Right.
So if they went on testosterone therapy for a prolonged period of time and came off testosterone, and they have diminished ovarian reserve after they come off, it would not likely be caused by the testosterone therapy, but by the passage of time and their advancing age.
Yeah. Yeah, just because you're trans doesn't mean that you are immune to the age-related decline in fertility.
Right.
Yeah.
The other model that some have suggested is that there's a disease condition called PCOS, a polycystic ovarian syndrome, where women do not ovulate. And in those women, typically they have high levels of testosterone. These are testosterone that's produced endogenously, so it's not exogenous testosterone that they are taking. And so the endogenous levels of testosterone contributes to their suppression of ovarian function and ovarian ovulation. And so some have suggested that transgender men who take testosterone therapy put themselves into a sort of a pseudo-PCOS type of situation, which then prevents the ovaries from ovulating, but it doesn't affect their ovaries from being able to ovulate and function if the testosterone went away.
Interesting. All right.
If I could just add, too, to what Dr. Pang said, what I really would like to also point out is there is no long-term data that we have available in the research yet to show what the long-term effects of testosterone is on the unborn potential child. So we don't know what testosterone or estrogen, for that matter, does in the long run to the gametes for either sex. So while these fertility options are possible in terms of the eventual offspring that are born, we don't know what the gender treatments may be doing to the gametes.
That is absolutely correct. We don't have that information.
Okay, and that begs the question that I would assume that a transgender guy would be off of testosterone for a long enough period for it to be out of his system, and then the eggs would be removed. And if am I hearing you correctly, Dr. Joseph, that the concern maybe we don't have research that would indicate that even though you wait X number of months, whatever is recommended by your doctor, that the testosterone could have impacted the eggs in some way, thus impacting the gamete that might be developed from that egg. Did I understand you correctly?
Correct. And some of that would be really longitudinal research. We're looking at the developmental process, the cognitive processes, the emotional processes, things that may take even decades to be clear. We just don't have that research available yet.
Decades and the willingness and a big enough sample size and the willingness to do the research. All of that, because I think that would be important. Because one of the questions that we'll let's go ahead and ask it now. Because another question is, then do you, if the trans man is choosing to be the one who is pregnant, which is not always the reason why he might be preserving his fertility. His partner might be wanting to carry the pregnancy with his egg or a surrogate or something. But if he was choosing to be the one who carried the pregnancy, would he have to stay off of all treatments, testosterone being the primary one that I know of, during the length of the pregnancy?
Yes.
Okay, Dr. Pang, I think since it's medical, let me ask you that.
Yes. We would not want him to be taking testosterone therapy during pregnancy.
Yeah. Okay. So that would be an entirely different issue of health to the child or the potential impact. All right.
Yes. If anything, that would be much more likely to influence the fetus than testosterone influencing the gametes.
Gotcha.
Because the fetus would be exposed to testosterone for the duration of the pregnancy, and we don't have any longitudinal data showing what effect, if any, that might have on the fetus.
All right. Dr. Joseph, now again, we're still talking transgender men. What other forms of treatment do some men use during transition or to transition that would impact fertility? I guess the obvious one would be removal of ovaries and or uterus, which would significantly, obviously, impact future fertility. Are there other things that might be done or might be considered in transition that he should think about before transition if he thinks that he wants to preserve the option of having a genetic child?
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I think is very important is the emotional health of the transgender person with ovaries. So some people are not necessarily binary, going to be saying that they're male. They might see themselves in a different non-binary sense altogether. So if we talk about people with ovaries who have transitions, one of the things that I say from a psychological standpoint that's really important for them to be considering in their treatment is if they do ever decide to carry a pregnancy and they do therefore need to go off their hormones, there's a large amount of feminine, very typically feminine sorts of feminization of the body and the pregnancy and going through all that, and a lot of female hormones that are going to be flowing, which can create very much of a return of gender dysphoria that may have been there prior to their transitioning. So there's a lot of psychological risks go in terms of building a family and actually being the one to carry that pregnancy, because it does suspend your gender treatment temporarily, at least, while you're going through the procedures for having the child.
I'm glad you raised that, because it's hard for me to imagine anything more feminine than pregnancy and birth. And if you don't identify as female, how difficult is that on an emotional level to then be going through something that is so female, if that makes sense? Dr. Joseph?
Absolutely. And as well, a postpartum depression is also a possibility and likely afterwards. You know, there's a lot of hormones that go on naturally in the body during any pregnancy, so that is going to bring up a lot of concerns for mood issues that may trigger a gender dysphoria type depression or anxiety, other sorts of issues. So all women who are having pregnancies and post-pregnancy are at risk for postpartum depression, but especially people who may have already transitioned now that they've gone through this period and their hormones are the ones that were helpful for their child to be born may now not feel right anymore and be a risk emotionally.
Dr. Joseph, how common is it in your practice to see a trans or a binary man want to be the one who carries a pregnancy?
Well, you know, I have clients in my practice who do that, but I also have colleagues all over the country that also will call me for consultation where they're seeing clients come in with these same desires to carry a pregnancy, and they'll also ask questions about it. So we'll talk about these sorts of possibility of mood issues that can reoccur. So I see it in my practice, but I also hear from colleagues across the country that are also having people come in. So I don't know the exact numbers, but it's definitely common and happening.
Well, and you know, it's and it's a real issue that trans men may face. Number one, their partner could be a man, obviously, and not able to be pregnant, or their partner, if female, might be infertile. And the reality is there is discrimination in the adoption world against transgender people. So even if originally that is not something that he thought he would want, life circumstances may present themselves that if he and his partner, or just he by himself, wants a child, it may be the only way for him to become a parent. So it's confusing. And I guess that begs the issue that I have been really wrestling with, is that we see a movement, or we've at Creating a Family, we've done an interview in the past based on raising a transgender child. And one of the things that came out there, as well as just in the common media, we're hearing more parents being open to considering allowing their children to transition at a much earlier age. And there's some advantages to that, you know, before the secondary sexual features come out. So there are certainly some advantages for the trans person. But I can't help but think that talking about fertility preservation, if you're talking about this would be starting at ages 10, 11, 12, something like that.
Correct.
What do you do? Yeah, let me start. I'd like to hear both of your thoughts on this, because from a parent standpoint who's facing this issue, because it really, in that case, if you're talking about a 10 or 11-year-old child, the parents are heavily involved in the decision. So let's start with you, Dr. Joseph, and then Dr. Pang. I'd like to hear from you as to what are the options for both the trans child as well as the parents when trying to preserve options for the future, but at such a young age you don't know, and the child's certainly not thinking at that point about having a family. Go ahead, Dr. Joseph.
Right. So I work with a lot of older children and adolescents who are actually considering a gender transition, and this is very important to, like I said before, think about, discuss with the child or adolescent and the parents, because it's really the parent or the guardian that is going to be giving legal consent for any sort of gender transition treatments that are medical. and the child or adolescent has to give their assent, meaning they have to agree and that that's what they want. And that really needs to be made clear in the treatment for the gender dysphoria, that they have been apprised of and understand the benefits and risks of the gender medical treatments on their fertility and be told what their options would be from a medical perspective. And we really are asking children and adolescents and parents to be thinking about something that they really wouldn't necessarily be thinking of at this time of their life. Usually at the time of their life where they're turning into teenagers, we're saying, you use birth control, don't have children as a teenager. And now we're asking them to think about, how do you want to have a family and what do you want to do? And that's really shocking for some people to really consider so early. So working with a psychologist who really understands the gender issues and concerns and the fertility issues and concerns, along with a multidisciplinary team of an endocrinologist, reproductive endocrinologist, of family doctor, pediatrician. All this is really important in building a team to make sure you have empowering information from a variety of sources to make the best decision that one can at the time given what they have.
Dr. Pang, are there ways to preserve fertility with a child at pre-puberty?
At this point in time, there are not that I'm aware of, and this topic is really something that I've been very concerned about. In fact, I led a mini symposium at the WPATH meeting in Los Angeles earlier this year where we addressed some of these concerns, and Dr. Joseph mentioned many of them. And primarily it is that when you are counseling a child who is 9 or 10 or 11 prepubescent about fertility options, they really are not emotionally and mature enough to make that decision. And by going through puberty suppression and some medical treatment for transition, we are essentially taking away their ability to ever have genetic children. And it is a major life decision that we are putting on a young child. And that has significant ethical and, legal and psychosocial implications.
If I could also just jump in, and Dr. Pang is 100% right, there's also an option which is considered still experimental and in its very early phases, but the possibility of testicular tissue cryopreservation or ovarian tissue cryopreservation for in the possible future, if there are ways to help people with their fertility, that might be something that science can offer. At this moment, it's not in the United States. It's experimental, but in other countries are also doing this sort of experimental cryopreservation with the tissues. So that's in the future something that might be considered, because for some children and adolescents, for them to go through their natal puberty may be a life-threatening issue for them. So that if they're going to be so depressed, so anxious, have so many issues, 40% of transgender individuals attempt suicide, it may be life-saving for them to have their gender medical treatments early on before puberty even starts. And at that point, their gametes are not going to be viable for reproduction. So their only option at that point would be to cryopreserve the tissue, and perhaps in the future science can be helpful for them.
Or other options for family building, to consider those options as well, and to start considering those as options.
Absolutely. There's so many options outside of having one's own biological child. There's many ways to create a family.
Mm-hmm. Yep, you're preaching to the choir on that one. All right. Now, we've talked about transgender men. Let's talk about transgender women, and just to get everybody on the same page. That's someone who is thought to be male at birth but identifies as female and is living as a female. am I right, Dr. Pang, to assume that there are fewer issues associated with reproductive issues as far as family building for trans women?
Well, you're absolutely right that it is much simpler to preserve fertility for trans women because all they need to do is to freeze their sperm before they go through the transition. In contrast, trans men have to freeze eggs if they are planning to preserve their fertility, and collecting eggs to freeze from a trans man is much more complicated and invasive than collecting sperm from a trans woman to freeze. So, you know, they actually have it easy in a sense because if they are counseled prior to transition and they just need to go to a sperm bank and freeze their sperm, and then they'll be all set.
Dr. Joseph, is it, from an emotional standpoint, we talked earlier with trans men about the emotional impact of going through, of stopping the testosterone, taking the hormones that would be needed for, because it's not just stopping the testosterone that a trans man would have to do, but then he would have to take the medication that's used to stimulate the ovaries to produce more eggs. So that's like a super dose of hormones. For men, for a trans woman, that's for a trans man. For a trans woman, what would the procedure be, and would it be less emotionally nerve-wracking simply because it's generally wouldn't take as long?
Well, going off of anybody's gender treatment or postponing their gender treatment, whether it's going to be testosterone or estrogen or the blockers, can be stressful for anybody regardless of where they fall on the gender spectrum. So it's going to be a case-by-case basis.
That's a valid point. Yeah, that was almost showed hubris to assume that just because a trans woman is going off of her estrogen that it would be less impactful. I was thinking in terms of the amount of time it would take, but you're right, it could be equally as impactful. If a
transgender...
Go ahead.
Sorry.
No,
I was going to say that a transgender woman taking estrogen would suppress spermatogenesis to levels that are very, very low or sometimes even non-existent. And there's a possibility that suppression may not be reversible in contrast to the suppression of testosterone in transgender men. I've actually only treated one transgender woman who had been on estrogen therapy for about 7 years prior to coming to me, and despite going off estrogen therapy, her sperm production never quite recovered. I mean, there was some sperm production, but it was extremely low. Now, I have no way of knowing whether that was the way it was before she transitioned or whether the estrogen therapy suppressed her spermatogenesis to the point where it didn't recover. But I always counsel people that if they're going to preserve fertility, they should really do this before they start the hormones in transition.
Well, and that raises a question. If you've got a trans woman who has not had surgery to remove her genitalia, is it possible to, and I realize this is not either an inexpensive or it's an invasive process, an expensive process, but is it possible to be able to extract sperm from her testes that could then be used in IVF, or so in other words, even though she's not ejaculating sperm, she may still be producing sperm, or is that really, is it, does the estrogen affect even the very production? Dr. Pang?
We know that the estrogen affects the production, so yes, it is potentially possible that even if there is no sperm in the ejaculate, if we try to extract sperm from the testicles or the epididymis, if there's sperm there to be extracted, then yes, the strategy would work, but it's possible that the spermatogenesis may be suppressed to a level that the sperm aren't even being produced, so that going into the testes and epididymis, if we don't recover any sperm there because of this suppression, then there's nothing to freeze.
Okay. And so, again, the real strength, the real point here is that all of this needs to be considered prior to transition. And let me just give you some information from the National Center for Transgender Equality. They're saying that hormone treatment for a male to female transition is less reversible than hormone treatment for female to male transition. So a female to male who takes testosterone can remain fertile for a number of years after beginning hormone treatment, whereas a male to female who takes estrogen, can face irreversible fertility loss within a couple of months even. There's some research that indicates that, but I think the reality is there isn't enough research on this issue, which is something that Dr. Joseph had talked about at the beginning. And it really needs to be long-term.
That is accurate based on my personal experience.
Okay. And if a trans woman has gone through surgery to remove external male genitalia, Dr. Pang, I'm assuming there is no way then for a doctor to be able to get sperm to be able to use for insemination. It sounded like it wasn't a guarantee, even if she still had external male genitalia.
Correct. If the testes are not have been surgically removed, then there's nothing to retrieve sperm from.
Okay.
But even if they have not been removed, the prolonged estrogen therapy could suppress spermatogenesis to the point where it doesn't recover.
Gotcha. Okay. Excellent. All right. Let me break for a moment to remind everyone that we are talking today about transgender reproductive issues, both the medical and the emotional. And our guests are Dr. Samuel Payne and Dr. Jamie Joseph. You are listening to an interview on creating a family. We want you to know that we have a website chock full of information that are useful for those who are trying to create a family in any way, including through infertility treatment or through adoption. And you can get more resources on all of those options at our website, creatingafamily.org. All right. Before we stop talking about health issues and move on to some other topics, I think it's important to note that there was some really startling research from the CDC that talked about, the research that I was reading was only talking about HIV, but it was that transgender people are 4 times the national average for getting an HIV infection. And then there was some other research that expanded that to sexually transmitted diseases as well. So I think that it's important to note, and Dr. Joseph, I'm going to let you get on a soapbox here because I suspect that you do have a soapbox on how people, transgender people, are needing to be aware of, and as well as the medical profession needs to be aware of, that they're at high risk.
Mm-hmm. Right. So gender treatment is not protective against pregnancy or sexually transmitted diseases. So if one is going to be engaging in sexual activity, regardless of their gender, they need to take steps to protect their health and to avoid any unwanted pregnancies, regardless of their gender. So I always tell that to people, that having gender treatment doesn't make you immune to disease or pregnancy. You're just as at risk as other people are, especially for sexually transmitted diseases, and you need to be aware of that and not think that there's this veil of protection because of the hormones that you're taking, because there's not. It does nothing for disease prevention.
And so, Dr. Joseph, at what age is the typical age that a transgender person starts thinking about having a family and then facing these issues? My guess is it's not going to be when they're younger. But I'm curious to know from your practice, and if you happen to know from research, I wasn't able to find any, but there may be some. Are transgender people considering at the same ages that cisgender people are considering families? Is it a little later, since they're later oftentimes coming into their sexuality and finding partners? If there's a common age that you see that this becomes an issue for this community?
So there's no research available that says at what age this would happen, and it's probably pretty varied for transgender individuals as it would be as well for cisgender individuals. But in terms of when do people think about this, when I bring this up to the children and younger adolescents that I work with, they often look at me like I'm crazy when I ask them, have you thought about having children? Because they're really thinking about, does their body match who they think they are, and can they make that be a better fit for them? And I start to talk to them about the fact that even though they might not be thinking about those things, these are important things that they need to be talking about and thinking about with their families, because they need to have all this information in their minds and in their plan before any medical treatments would take place, so that they're aware of the risks of any of the medical treatments. So, yes, I do bring this up to children and adolescents, and it's hard because sometimes we're not even sure if the child really understands sexual reproduction. So we need to also really be maybe teaching a little bit about biology and sexual reproduction and how that works and how that might fit for them, and asking them again to really hypothesize what they may want a really long time from now is difficult for them. So what I'll talk to people about is you can change your mind if you preserve your fertility in some way. You don't need to use what you've preserved, but it could be a little bit of an insurance policy if, in fact, you wanted to try to go that route in the future. You are allowed to change your mind. I'm not asking you to make definite decisions for 20 or 30 years from now, but you need to start planning, because your decisions today are going to have impact on what happens then.
Yeah, that seems to be the recurring message that we're coming back to. Dr. Pang, in your practice as a reproductive endocrinologist, a fertility doctor, do you see more trans women or trans men coming in?
I see a lot of trans men coming in. Most of the trans men are coming in for fertility preservation, and they're coming in typically in their 20s. I have seen several teenage trans men who are 16, 17, and counsel them about fertility preservation. I will have to say that none of them have actually come back to do the fertility preservation, but certainly they have been educated and informed about what their options are. So I feel that they're making an informed decision.
And
I have only ever treated.
Go ahead.
I have only ever treated one trans woman. She was married to a cisgender woman, and because of her very low sperm counts, despite coming off estrogen therapy, they required IVF to conceive. And I'm happy to say that she and her wife were able to conceive successfully with IVF.
And either in your practice and also just from what you know with your involvement in this field nationwide, how often are we seeing trans men choosing to carry a pregnancy? Because that's what people are often thinking about, the pregnant man type of scenario. So how often are you actually seeing that?
Well, I have only seen one case, and that was a trans man who attempted to get pregnant with donor sperm insemination, but was unsuccessful and ultimately required IVF to conceive. And that's when he came to my attention, being referred from the facility that was helping him achieve pregnancy with just donor sperm insemination. I do not have any experience with trans men doing donor insemination to attempt pregnancy, because if they are successful in doing that, they never come to my attention, never come to my practice. So in a sense, I've got a very highly specialized field where the only people who come to my attention are people who require, higher level assisted reproduction.
Yeah, that makes very good sense. Dr. Joseph, where are trans people getting their information and their support and their accurate medical information? Do you find that there is a prejudice in general from the healthcare community for treating trans people and giving them accurate information? Because there's a lot of information that they need to think about if they're going to try to create a family after they've already transitioned. Where are they getting their information?
Where are the clients getting their information from, or the patients getting their information from? Well, so unfortunately, there's a lot of medical providers also that are not well informed about gender issues and transgender treatments. Some are wonderful and know a lot about that. Others are just learning. So it really varies, especially geographically where one is located, how up to date the providers might be in terms of the newest kinds of technology and opinions.
Yeah, there was this national survey that was done, I believe it was 2015, and it found that between 19 and 27% of transgender people reported being turned away by healthcare providers who refused to provide care for them. That's absolutely mind-boggling, because if they're not getting information from a medical provider, I will say I should back up and say there are some great organizations who are providing some very good, accurate medical information. But we shouldn't be getting our medical information online. I mean, we can get some of it, but we should be seeking out. In your experience, does that the 19 to 27% being turned away, is that what you were seeing, and is that what you were hearing as well?
I hear and see a mix. I've heard negative stories. I've heard wonderful stories. It's very varied.
Well, I guess that's reassuring. Dr. Pang, I hear tell that there are clinics who won't work with transgender patients. And by clinics, I mean fertility clinics. And you may not have, I doubt there's been any research on that, but do you have a feel, just from your involvement in this field, for the acceptance of the infertility clinic medical professionals as far as treating transgender people?
I don't have any data to share. I don't even have a field, because I haven't really done any type of polling of the clinics, so I can't answer that question. But what I do know is that, just off the top of my head, there may be two main reasons why clinics may turn away transgender people. The first one is just prejudice. We know that there are IVF clinics that will not treat lesbian or gay patients either, for discriminatory reasons, typically religious reasons. And then there are those that are hesitant to treat because they don't feel that they are adequately equipped, and maybe their staff is not adequately equipped to manage lesbian, gay, or transgender people. And that may be a secondary reason why some clinics are hesitant to treat LGBTQ patients.
Well, you raise a valid point that the issue of prejudice is not exclusive to the T part of the LGBTQ. It can be across the board. So that's actually a valid point. Dr. Joseph, what is the research showing? There may not be much, because that seems to be another recurring thing we are talking about in this interview, and that is the lack of good research. But what is the research showing as far as the mental health of children who are raised by a transgender parent, either a parent born once the transition, I mean, I'm not parent, I mean the child born after their transition was complete, and so, or a child whose parent transitions after the child has been born.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So their data is sparse on that. There's not a lot of research, which is pretty much in all areas of what we're talking about with regard to gender issues. But the sparse research that we have does not indicate that there is a negativity or a harm caused to children being raised by transgender parents, that there are no reasons to be working to prevent that the children are equally as likely to have positive outcomes regardless of their parents' gender status.
That's interesting. And Dr. Susan Gollenbach has done a tremendous amount of research. I don't know in the families who don't necessarily meet gender norms. I don't know if she has done any research specific to transgender. She has a great book called Modern Families, and she's been on the show a number of times, and we've interviewed her. Do you know if she has done anything? I just really appreciate her research quite a bit.
I'm not aware of any research that she's done. It's possible that she has something in progress, but I haven't seen anything recent in the literature that would suggest there's a published study on that.
Okay. So I guess that's something that when we're talking about anything with kids, we need to be thinking in terms of their ultimately what's in the best interest of the child. In this case, there is no reason to think, there's no research that would indicate that having I would assume that some of the same issues that we talk about with same-sex couples would apply, and the primary one being finding role models for your child.
Absolutely. There's no data supporting that children are harmed by being raised by transgender parents. No data to support that. So children are able to develop healthy and prosper based on parenting, not what their parent's gender is.
Mm-hmm. And you can make the argument that parents who've had to struggle very hard to become a parent will have thought through ways such as finding role models of the gender that they don't represent for their child, and other things that they've had to think through. That's certainly what some of the research is indicating as far as same-sex parents. So interesting and fascinating. As far as, let me circle back to transitioning where there is a surgical procedure done, and the question would be: is there obviously if you have a surgical medical procedure, procedure done that would aid in transition, other than fertility preservation, is there anything that could be done that would preserve the option for either a trans woman or a trans man to be able to still have some reproductive capability later in life? I'm not talking fertility preservation now. I'm talking about if there is a surgical option, are there options that are fertility preserving that trans people should consider? Dr. Payne?
Well, if they have a hysterectomy and it's a total hysterectomy where their ovaries are removed, then, that renders them sterile. They would not be able to have a child, either carrying a child himself or using his own eggs or gametes. And similarly for a trans woman, if she has her testicles surgically removed, then there would not be that option.
Is there for a trans man? is there an option that he would have to have some surgery to make his external genitalia conform to his identity, but would preserve the uterus or the ovaries, either one?
Yes.
Is that an option?
That's not my field, but the surgery that's done on the external genitalia may not involve surgery on the uterus or the ovaries. So
correct.
I was just going to turn to you, Dr.
It is possible that surgery be done on the external genitalia be done leaving the internal genitalia, the uterus and the ovaries intact.
And Dr. Joseph, in your experience, are there advantages for that or disadvantages for that? And how do you counsel people who are trying to make the decision when at the time you're counseling them, the furthest thing from their mind is preserving their fertility, not preserving, because that's a different issue, but leaving open the option of being able to later have a reproductive function?
Mm-hmm. Well, I talk to people about it as a possible insurance policy. Like, you might want to do this in the future if you're not sure now. You don't need to decide, but you can preserve your inner organs and then consider options down the road. But again, the long-term treatment of the hormones on our function, we don't really know what that is. So just because one leaves their ovaries and uterus and goes through all the hormone treatments doesn't mean that it's going to function properly in 20 years from now. So there's a lot of unknowns. Just because you make this choice now doesn't even mean that it's going to work out the way we planned. We're just trying to give as many options as we can early on.
That's absolutely correct. And the other concern is, development of disease. And so in the internal organs that may present a problem later on.
Right. Once you're done with your reproductive organs in terms of the gender treatment, you really need to speak to a medical provider about whether or not maintaining those organs in the long term is a healthy choice or not a healthy choice, because you do need to be concerned about disease, cancers, and things that one might be prone to. So once you're done creating your family and you no longer would need those internal organs, that's a really good conversation to have with your medical team and providers.
Especially because you're not mentally thinking in your mind that this is something that you are susceptible to. If you are, a trans man, you're not necessarily thinking, oh, wait a minute, I have to worry about ovarian cancer.
And unfortunately,
cancer, yes.
A lot of people don't go to get the proper medical care because they're not thinking that way. And I always tell my patients, if you have those parts, you need to take care of them. So you need to be seeing doctors and talking to doctors at all points of your life about your internal organs, and especially your organs that are related to sex and fertility, in terms of keeping them healthy. If you have them, even if you don't identify as female and you have a uterus, you have to take care of that uterus.
Mm-hmm. Great advice. Thank you so much, Dr. Jamie Joseph and Dr. Samuel Pang, for talking with us today about reproductive health for the transgender community. We really appreciate it. Let me take a moment.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Let me remind people that the information given in this interview is general advice. To understand how to apply it to your specific situation, you'll need to work with your infertility professional. And for our audience who would like to get more information about Dr. Jamie Joseph, you can go to her website, which is jamiemjosephphd.com. I'm going to say it again, jamiemjosephphd.com. To get more information about Dr. Samuel Pang, you can go to his website, or the website of his practice, and that is IVFNE.com, and that stands for IVF New England. Thank you so much for being with us today, and I will see you next week.
Napa Know How. It's Love Your Car Month at Napa. And to show your car the love, get a Napa bucket for $2.99 and save 20% on almost everything you can fit inside, like car wash, car wax, and tire shine. So save some cash and look good doing it by getting 20% off with the Napa bucket. Quality parts, helpful people. That's Napa Know-How.
Napa Know-How.
At participating Napa Auto Parts stores, exclusions apply. Minimum 3 items may not be combined with other offers. Offer ends 4/30/19.
Right now at the Home Depot, you'll save up to 35% off appliance special buys, like a GE Appliances top-load washer and dryer pair, with deep clean and deep rinse options, a reliable heavy-duty agitator, and 4 precise water levels. Just $4.78 each. Wash, dry, save, repeat. Today is the day for doing, with Spring Black Friday savings now at the Home Depot. More saving, more doing. U.S. only while supplies last. Gas dryer extra. See store for details. Valid through April 17th.